So first of all, if we haven't got the pleasure of meeting, my name's Colter, and so this morning I would like to just start by honoring Pastor Brandon, our lead pastor, and saying thank you for letting me teach this morning and share a message. The past couple weeks, we have been talking through a series called Disciple, and so we've been looking at what does a disciple look like? And so today I want to teach on the ideal disciple. Pastor Brandon kind of covered a little bit of this last week, but I want to do a little bit deeper dive into what is the ideal disciple here at GC. So the thing is, everybody is following someone or something. Everybody's following either social media, everybody's following a trend or their favorite football team, or maybe even I might step on some toes, but you maybe even be following your favorite Christian influencer or pastor or author or whatever it may be, but everybody is following something. And so Jesus' call was never to believe, it was to follow. It was never to believe, it was to follow. And so in John 10, Jesus paints this picture of what it means to follow him fully. Not just as a religious leader with good moral values, but as a shepherd who gives life to his sheep. And so as we look at John 10, we'll see that the ideal disciple is not defined by the perfection of the sheep, but their proximity to the shepherd. Not by the perfection of the sheep, but their proximity to the shepherd. To be his disciple means to hear his voice, to enter his way, and to live in his abundant life. I'm going to read back through once more verses 1 through 5. And it says, "I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice." And so to give you a little context, right before this in John 9, we see Jesus heals a blind man. And in that moment, the Pharisees, who were big religious leaders at this time, they actually rejected not only the miracle that was done, but the person who did the miracle, Jesus. They rejected him. And so in John 10, where we're at now, it shows the difference between false messiahs and false shepherds like the Pharisees and the true shepherd, who is Jesus. And so Jesus calls his sheep by name. Discipleship is not about conformity. It's about a personal, real, relational call from the shepherd. I heard this back a few weeks ago, and I thought it was so cool. So growing up on a farm, we had what were called bummer goats. And so if you don't know what a bummer goat is, they have the same thing with sheep. So they call them bummer lambs. And so essentially what a bummer lamb is it's a lamb that the mother rejects. So the mother sheep, she will have her babies, and sometimes there's one that she'll reject. And so it gets the name of a bummer lamb. And so the thing about a bummer lamb is that if there's a shepherd taking care of these sheep, the shepherd will take this bummer lamb inside, give it warmth, it'll take care of it, it'll bottle feed it. And so the shepherd will take care of it and nurture it until it goes back to be able to be with the flock. And so he has to do this because if not, this bummer lamb will not die of starvation or weather or nothing like that. It will actually die of a broken heart before it dies of anything else. And so it's a perfect picture of what it looks like with Christ. Of when we are at our lowest, when we were in our hurt, when we're in our pain, when we're walking through some sort of trauma, when we're in our addiction, when we're at our lowest point, Jesus comes and picks us up, takes us inside, nurtures us, takes care of us, loves us, and comforts us until we're ready to be back assimilated into the flock. And so The ideal disciple is one who learns to recognize and respond to the shepherd's voice. The cool thing about a bummer lamb is that whenever the shepherd goes to the gate and calls the sheep and goes, sheep, sheep, come in, come in, come in. Whenever he does that, the first lambs that come, the first sheep that come to the shepherd are those bummer lambs because they recognize his voice and they've spent time with the shepherd. And so it's not that they're more important than the rest of the sheep, but they've spent time with the shepherd. And so the ideal disciple is one who learns to recognize and respond to the shepherd's voice over the noise of the world because they have spent time with the Father. Later on in verse 6, it says, those who heard Jesus use this illustration did not understand what he meant. So he explained it to them. He said, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and will find good pasture. You see, in ancient sheepfolds, oftentimes the shepherd would actually lay in the opening, and he would actually be a physical gate to where the sheep couldn't go in and out and guard them from the outside things. And so Jesus alone is the only way into salvation and security. You see, discipleship is not about adopting a set of moral teachings or whatever like that, but actually entering into a new life in him, entering into the abundant life that he offers. Back a little while ago, I decided that I was going to start hiking in the mornings. I live in Westmoreland, and so there's a park up in Scottsville, and they've got a bunch of like different trails kind of just all over. And so there's different like levels of these trails. There's different levels of these trails of like some are more hard than others and some are like fairly easy. And so one day when I started hiking on these trails, there was this one trail across the top that it's concrete, it's pretty flat, it's pretty easy. Just most about anybody could go on that trail. It's like pretty simple to go on. And then the trail that I started hiking on was called the Nature Trail. And so the Nature Trail, it kind of goes a little bit off, and so, but it's still graveled, and it has a little bit of areas where it's steep and a little bit hard, but for the most part, most people could go on that trail. It's a little bit harder than the concrete trail, but it's not super hard. And then I was hiking on that trail each day, and I kept on passing this little split off where there was this other trail. So this other trail looked a lot more difficult. It was like straight drop off down this bluff is what it looked like. Didn't look like it was very well maintained or whatever. And so each day I'd be like, one of these days I'm going to go past that trail, and it's going to be really cool when I go down it. But today is not the day, and I do not have time for that. So then finally one day I decided, hey, I'm going to go off down this trail. And so I start off down this trail, and it was steep, y'all. Like, it was not well maintained at all, and I'm like shifting my feet like this, and I was like, bro, it is 5:30 in the morning. I'm going to like fall, and nobody's going to find me for another 3 hours. And so I'm shifting my feet, and finally I get about halfway down this bluff, and in the most unlikely of places, there was a bench. And I was like, this is amazing. God sent this bench here for this moment. So I go and I sit on this bench for just a second, and I catch my breath, and I look out, and on the other side of this hill, there's like a view of this little river that runs through. Probably more like a creek, but it was about the size of a river, it felt like. But it was a super beautiful view. And so I was like, man, that was cool. I'm glad I went on this trail. And so something I didn't tell you is this trail that I was going on each day, I could see little glimpses of this trail along the way. And so I was like, I bet that's really beautiful down there. And so I started to kind of get to see some of the areas where I saw from the top that kind of intrigued me. And so then I get a little bit farther, And I get to this part right before this bridge, and where it had rained the day before, it was all muddy because this trail wasn't graveled like the one that I had been on. And so I'm getting my feet all wet. My socks are like soaking wet at this point. I'm like, are you kidding me right now? Like, this is so uncomfortable. And so I get a little bit farther, and I get out on this bridge. And I stand on this bridge for a second, and I look like both ways, and this is the view I see. And I will tell you, this view is like, this picture does not do it justice at all. If you can imagine, like right early in the morning, you hear the birds chirping, and this stream is flowing right below you. You can see this on both sides. There were some deer that walked down through an opening. It was just such like a beautiful view. And I'm like, man, this is so cool. Like, I'm so glad that I came down this way. And so I get to hiking, and something I didn't tell you at the beginning of this is that the reason that I started hiking in the mornings was, yes, partially to get some exercise in the morning, get me kind of woke up. That way I'm not like all irritating and grumpy whenever I show up to work in the morning. And so the other reason, and kind of the main reason for this, is as a form of silence and solitude. And so my goal for silence and solitude is to have this moment where like I completely clear my mind, because I feel like I have a very like overactive mind. My mind's running a bunch of different ways of like sermon stuff. I've got teams that I'm leading. I've got systems that I'm trying to build. I've got leadership packets that I'm trying to write. I've got a DTI class that I realize is a week from now. And all of these things are like running through my mind. And so I learned that like it's very hard for me to get in a still place and like clear my mind. And so my whole goal with silence and solitude is to get to that place where my mind is completely clear, so that way I can be able to hear from God. And so I've learned that hiking actually like gets me to that place a lot quicker. And so that morning I began my hike, and I started getting to that point of silence and solitude. And I just pray, God, like, speak to me on this hike. And so I get a little bit farther after we get past this bridge down here, and this is what I look down and see. And this was like just kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, all of this whole thing clicked for me. It says, forget the day's troubles, remember the day's blessings. And so all of a sudden it clicked of like, this is kind of a view of what discipleship looks like. Of like, hey, there's the trail at the top that's the easy concrete trail that the majority of people use. Like, this is the one that at the park each morning you'll see the most people on that trail. And so it's pretty easy, not super difficult. And then there's the nature trail. And that's kind of like when we say, hey, I believe in God. I'm going to come to church maybe once or twice a month. I'm going to make it a little bit inconvenient for me because I believe in Jesus. And so I want to go on this journey. And so that trail is like, it's a little bit harder, but pretty accomplishable. Like, it's not going to inconvenience a whole lot. But then there's that trail off of that is hard, and you're shifting your feet, and it's difficult, and it's steep, and your socks are soaking wet, and it's uncomfortable. But then when you get to the end of it, you look back and you say, man, there was troubles along the way, but look at all of the blessings that I got to experience along the way. Look at all the blessings that I got to be a part of along the way. And so the ideal disciple doesn't just admire Jesus from afar. They don't sit up on that nature trail and look down at discipleship and just say, well, that looks pretty cool. Like, I bet I could get a lot out of that, but it's not worth it. It's too steep. It's got too much mud. I want to keep my shoes clean. The ideal disciple doesn't admire Jesus from afar. They enter fully into his way. Discipleship means leaving behind self-made gates and false paths and stepping fully through Christ. It's about going down the beaten path that is less traveled. In verse 10, it says, the thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Other translations say, I've come to give an abundant life. And so false shepherds, like religious leaders, false messiahs, and even cultural idols, promise life but rob people of it. You think of every idol, it promises people life, but it robs people of it. And this is nothing new. This is nothing new at all. It's gone on for thousands of years since the beginning of time. I remember hearing a story one time back in the beginning of the Bible. It talks about how these people, they built this idol. And so they built this idol, and they would start out by simply saying a small prayer to this idol and be like, hey, bless my crops for the season. And then it got to the point where they started doing more and more and more and more and more to please this idol, all the way to the point that they would literally sacrifice their children to this idol, not to even get anything out of it, but simply to just be noticed by the idol. And that sounds super crazy to us. We're like, I can't believe those people would like sacrifice their children. But how many of us will start out with doing a little bit, and then we get to the point where we sacrifice our children's discipleship to Jesus just to be noticed by the idol that we've created in our life? And so this is nothing new. Jesus doesn't just give eternal life in the future. He gives an abundant life here and now. Becoming the ideal disciple allows us to not only experience eternal life in heaven, but also experience an abundant life on earth. If you get nothing out of this message, that's the little part that I want you to get out of this. Becoming the ideal disciple allows us to not only experience eternal life in heaven, but also experience an abundant life on earth. From John 10, we see that the ideal disciple is one who hears the shepherd's call, enters his way, and lives his abundant life. And so how does that shape us as a community of believers and disciples here at GC? The first way, and there's three ways, or not three ways, there's three parts of becoming the ideal disciple. The first part is being committed to community. Sheep are not called to live in isolation, they're called to live in the flock. And it's the same way with us. We are called to live in community. The ideal disciple lives in relationship with others who are following the shepherd. And so as disciples, as the ideal disciple, we should orient our whole entire life around this idea of community. It should be ingrained in our DNA. And so, for example, one way that I did this personally was over the past year, I've built a house. And so a year ago, I started this design process and figuring out what rooms went where and all this stuff like that. And so before I started this house, I had this idea of I want this house to match what I value. I want the layout to match what I value. And so one of those things that I place a high value on is community, is hospitality. I want to have a space to where I can have friends over. I can have my community be in my house. I can have my family over. I can have a big back porch that I can spend time with people over, because I know for me, that's when some of the greatest memories have happened, is when I'm in community. And so I wanted to prioritize that when I designed this house. And so if you were to look at the blueprint of this house, the bedrooms are pretty small, but probably 75% of my house is took up by one room, and that has the kitchen, the dining area, and my living room. And so it's one big room that's all designed around having community in it. And so whenever I got done building the house, I was like, okay, I got to find a dining room table, and I want this table to be able to fit 10 people at it. That way I can have a whole small group sitting at it. And so I was like, I want to have this big table. Currently, I had this table that I brought from my apartment, and it could seat 4 people, and if you pulled it out and put the leaf in it, you could put 6, but it wasn't super comfortable. It was tight. And so I was like, I'm going to find this table, and I started this search and found out really quickly any table that seated 10 people was going to be way out of my budget. Instantly, I knew that. And so I began the search on Marketplace, of course. That's where you go. And I began this search with my dad. And so finally, we found this table that was like 9 feet long from this guy in Smiths Grove, Kentucky that he had built. And it was $250. And I was like, I'm sold. I'll have to figure out the whole chair situation and get chairs off of Amazon. But I got the table. And so I measured out, and I was like, I think it'll fit. Like, I'm pretty sure it'll fit. And I go to pick up this table from this guy's house, and we go to load it in the back of my truck. And I was looking at it, I was like, I'm not sure this is going to fit. It's going to be a little bit big for the room. Because, like, this is the biggest room in my house. My house isn't crazy big either. And so I get home with it, and my dad and my brother-in-law, and all the way home, I'm sitting here thinking through, like, okay, how could I cut this table down and it not be super noticeable that I cut it down? Like, how can I cut it up to make it shorter? And so I get home with it, and my dad and my brother-in-law help me unload it. And so we get it into the dining area. And this was so funny, y'all. Like, we get this table in here finally. Like, we're, like, moving it around, trying to get it into here. And we put it in here, and we all step back and look at it. And my dad's like, I think it's a little too big. And I was like, nope, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it fits perfect. And so then my mom comes over the next day, and she's like, I think it's a little bit too big. And I was, like, in denial. I was like, nope, I don't know what you're talking about. But the thing is here's a picture of the table. And this picture doesn't really show completely how much way too big it is for the room. But this isn't how I imagine this table to look. The second picture is. This is a picture a few weeks later. We had our summer interns this summer. And so I actually got to have 2 small groups towards the end of their internship at my house. And so we got to spend time sitting around a table, hanging out, being able to share in life, get to have community with each other, get to talk through formation. And then that night was the last night, and we actually watched Lemonade Mouth because we were like, y'all have to watch that. And they were a lot younger than us, and they were like, what are you talking about? So, but yeah, that's how I pictured this table to look like, surrounded by a community. And so my challenge is to commit to authentic, accountable, spirit-filled community. Here at GC, this can look a few different ways. It can look like a community group. It can look like a formation group. It can look like serving together. My only thing is be intentional with it. A lot of times we can be like, well, I hang out with so-and-so every once in a while, and we have these couples that every couple of months that we go and hang out with and maybe watch a movie with or something like that, and we count that as our community. But I would encourage you, be intentional with your community of saying, hey, who do I want to intentionally invite into my life to be consistent community for me? Who's going to have those accountable conversations with me? Who am I going to be comfortable with enough to be able to have confession with? And how can I have it consistent enough in my life that it makes an impact? And so commit to community. The second way is to be focused on formation. The sheep recognized the shepherd's voice because they had spent time listening to his voice. The ideal disciple doesn't just settle for belief. They're shaped by listening and being obedient. They're shaped by listening and being obedient to the shepherd. So I encourage you, commit to a role of life. Commit to prayer and scripture and community and generosity and service and witness and fasting and having a Sabbath. And I want to tell you, like, just to start off with this, if you haven't implemented any of the practices, don't start them all at one time. Because when you hear us talk about the practices, you're like, I do not have time for that. Like, I've already got a busy life. How am I going to incorporate all of these things into my daily life? And so don't start out with saying, hey, I was inspired to form a rule of life, and on Monday, you write your rule of life early in the morning, and then you try to go do all of the practices tomorrow morning, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I got 2 of them. I got 2 of them done because my schedule's already too busy. And so then you get frustrated, and then you put it to the side, and then you get inspired the next time that we talk about a rule of life. And so I want to encourage you, start with one practice. Get really consistent, get really good at practicing that one practice. You got a range of options. And as you start to implement that practice, you'll slowly realize that being committed to practices and having a rule of life is not about adding things to your life. It's about subtracting things from your life. It makes no sense. When we talk about it, it makes no sense of how could I add stuff and then it's going to subtract things to my life. But I encourage you, commit to one, and you'll see what I'm talking about, of how it subtracts things from your life. It causes you to slow down in your life. And so then, too, once you start implementing these different practices, slow walk them. Don't be like, hey, I'm going to implement this practice this week and the next one the next week. Sit in it for a while. I would say we're demonstrating this as a church of we're going through 8 communal practices and our rule of life as a whole entire church, and we're going over it in a 2-year span. We spent the last semester, covering 2 practices. This next semester, starting next week, we're going to start covering 2 more, and so on for the next 2 years, and have a rotating kind of series on the practices. So my encouragement also is say, hey, I've been having a rule of life for quite a while now, and I've implemented all of the practices in my life. I'm kind of in that stage where I've implemented all these practices, and so you're like, now what? Do I just keep on doing these? I would encourage you, go back through those practices and continue to see how you can dive deeper in them, and be able to implement different things or take different next steps. I would say one that I'm about to start rolling into is a Sabbath of I already have a Sabbath, but I want to discover how can I dive in even deeper in this? How can I take next steps in my Sabbath? The practice that I just finished and kind of been walking through the past couple of months of doing more of a deep dive in was generosity. And so through that, I discovered for me, one of the things I learned was that I have been limited by my tithe for a while. And so it sounds weird and doesn't really make sense. But what I mean by being limited by my tithe is I've had this mindset of okay, if I give my 10%, then that's my generosity for the next 2 weeks. And so I've been limited by that instead of saying how can I be a generous person? How can I have it in every aspect of my life? How can I give more than 10% to my tithe? How can I walk through life with a heart of generosity? It was cool when I was walking through this practice back a few weeks ago. I was kind of asking on one of those hikes of hey, God, place somebody in my life today that I can practice this with. And it was literally that afternoon. I had a perfect example of somebody. It was you don't know this, but God has sent you as the next step in my life. And so I got to have that moment of saying is this something I actually want to take next step in, or is it just something that it sounds like a really good idea? And so in that moment, I want to say it was super easy and I just had a super peace about it, but it was actually really hard. In that moment, I had this opportunity to bless someone and give them some money that, for me, felt like a big amount. And so literally the whole time I'm having this conversation with this person, and I've literally got a check in my pocket. And the whole time I'm thinking, if I just walked away, he would never know this check is in my pocket right now. And so, we're having this conversation. And even once I gave the check to him, I'm pulling out of the parking lot. I'm sitting there, I'm maybe he won't go to the bank. And so I'm running through this whole thing. But then, after that, looking back a couple of days later, I was man, that really blessed me. And also, that changed my heart. of being able to take that next step in generosity. And so continue to be working through those practices and seeing the next steps that you can take in your life with it. The next way that we can be committed to community is by moving on mission. The shepherd leads his sheep out to pasture. The ideal disciple is not static, they are sent. To follow Jesus is to join him in his mission for the world. They're about to put a picture up on the screen. And I want to talk to you about a guy that I believe is like the exact definition of moving on mission to the fullest out of all the people that I've interacted with in my life. So this guy in the blue sitting right here on a street corner, his name is Pastor Roberto. And so Pastor Roberto's story is really cool. About 20 years ago, he's working at this little shop that they're sitting in front of, and he felt just this heavy heart for homeless people in San Jose, Costa Rica. And so there, it's a massive problem. Like there's tens of thousands of people that are homeless on these streets here in this one city. And like, I would even go to the extent of saying like their homelessness is a little bit different than our homelessness. It's a little bit more extreme. People, like tons of people are just literally starving to death. And so Pastor Roberto, he felt this heart for the homeless, and he decided like, hey, I'm going to go sleep on this street every night with these homeless people, and I'm going to share the gospel with them. And so he's done that for the past like 15 or 20 years. He's been sleeping on that sidewalk each night and having men that are homeless with him sleep beside him. And he helps them like know how to take care of their area. He helps them walk through their addiction. He helps them with getting food. He loves on them. He gets to learn their name, something that we call this ministry where we go out and help different homeless people in the streets of San Jose is the No Name Ministry. Because we have large groups of people that nobody knows their name. And so like one of the goals is to be able to be there for somebody, but also just have for them one other person on this planet that knows what their name is. And so Pastor Roberto has done that to the fullest of like sitting with people and meeting people where they're at. Someone who is moving on mission, the ideal disciple, they are taking Jesus where they live, where they work, and where they play. They're sharing the gospel, and they're meeting people where they're at. They're meeting them in their pain. They're meeting them in their hurt. They're meeting them when they haven't gotten their life all together. And so Pastor Roberto is an exact example of meeting people where they are. We can't just wait for people to get their act together or get cleaned up. There's people that I've seen sit on this corner that they just got their fix of cocaine or heroin, and then they come and they eat. And so Pastor Roberto, he meets them right where they are and shares the gospel with them and loves on them. And so you might not start out with like sleeping on the street like Pastor Roberto. Maybe your version of moving on mission is serving in the local church. And I'm sure that y'all are like, man, if they say something about serving one more time, I'm going to like go crazy. But we say it a lot of times when we speak about serving. We say it from a place of not that we need volunteers, which we do, by the way, but we don't say it from that place. We say it from the place of like, we know what it's done in our lives. We know the way that it's impacted our lives. And so a perfect example of this is a story I heard the other day. It was about a guy that was probably one of the most spiritually influential people in our nation's history that no one will ever know his name. Like it's literally impossible for anybody to ever find out his name. And the story all starts with a guy named Mordecai Ham. Mordecai Ham was actually from Scottsville. I learned this in between the experiences a few minutes ago. He was actually from Scottsville, Kentucky, which I was like, that's cool. But Mordecai Ham was a tent revival preacher. And so he would go and he would preach these sermons and just share the gospel with people. And so one night he's out and he's teaching in this tent revival, and he's sharing the gospel, and these two 14-year-old boys walk by. These two 14-year-old boys walk by, and they hear him preaching, and so they come in, and they decide, like, hey, we're going to come check him out, and there was no chairs. So they turn around, and they start to leave. But then there was this guy that was an usher that night, and he goes running after them, and he says, wait, come back. We'll make room for you. And so he goes in, and he asks some people to, like, scoot in some on a row, and he says, hey, I've got 2 chairs for you right here. And so these 2 boys, they sit down, these 2 14-year-old boys, and they hear the gospel for the very first time, and that night they decide to give their heart and life to Christ. You want to know who those 14-year-old boys were? One of them was by the name of Billy Graham. If you don't know who Billy Graham is, he went on to preach the gospel to probably more amounts of people than probably anybody in history. He would go and have these crusades and share the gospel to tens of millions of people. And the second boy's name was Grady Wilson. Grady Wilson would actually organize these events. And so one man completely changed the world. And when I say that, I'm not talking about Mordecai Ham. I'm not talking about Billy Graham. I'm not talking about Grady Wilson. I'm talking about the usher who made a room. And so the thing is like, your calling may not feel like it has a massive impact. You may not be called to completely change the world, but you may be called to change one person's world. And so you may be saying, hey, I'm just telling people to move in and scooch out, and like this doesn't have a great impact. But in reality, you could be making a way for somebody to hear the gospel for the very first time, hear somebody that completely changes their life, completely changes their family tree, and redirects all of that history. And so if it was for the one, it was worth it. And so I want to ask today, what is your plan for discipleship? And is it working? Is it working? Will you commit to an authentic, accountable, spirit-filled community? Commit to a role of life. Commit to live as a witness where you live, where you work, and where you play. Because the shepherd is calling, and he's calling you by name. My challenge today is to not just believe, but to follow.